Welcome to Excel Business Statistical Analysis video number 4. And in this video, we got to talk about the amazing Excel tools, Power Query, and the pivot table. And we're going to see 3 great uses for these tools. First, we'll see how to use the pivot table to build a frequency distribution, and that'll demonstrate that the pivot table tool is flat out easy. Then we'll see the amazing Power Query to import and transform a CSV file. And finally, we'll learn how to use the pivot table grouping feature for quantitative data to build frequency distributions. And if you thought you knew how to use the grouping feature, you better check this video out because there are some hot tips. Now in this video, we're going to have 2 different proper data sets that we need to create tabular reports for. The first one is going to be a simple 1-column table in the Excel worksheet, and we'll create a frequency distribution. The other table is going to have multiple columns, and it's going to come to us not in the Excel file, but as a CSV file. Then we'll create this tabular report where we need to group by seconds with an upper and lower limit to count occurrences. We'll also create these other 2 frequency distributions using the pivot table. Now we're in Chapter 1 Excel file, and we're on the sheet pivot table. Here's our data set. We went out and took a sample of people's phone preferences. And our goal is to take this data, create a unique list. That means one of each phone, count how many times each phone occurred, and then calculate the percent of total. Now the tool we're going to use to create this tabular report is the pivot table. Now this tool has been in Excel since 1993, and it's the most used data analysis tool in the world. Why? Because it's so easy to use. And in this statistics class, most of the reports we're going to create with a pivot table. Now we have a proper data set, field name at the top, records and rows, and empty cells all the way around. So we click in one single cell, doesn't matter which cell in the proper data set, go up to Insert, Tables Group, and click the Pivot Table button. In the Pivot Table from Table or Range dialog box, it'll always get this first step correct if you have a proper data set and a single cell is selected. So all we have to do is to decide where we want to put it. So I'm going to say Existing Sheet, and I'm going to click in D2, click OK. Now there's a blank pivot table report here. And when you create a pivot table, the pivot table tool took the data set and stored it in a behind-the-scenes location called a PivotTable Cache. And most of the time, you do not need to worry about that PivotTable Cache. But as we'll see in our next pivot table, sometimes it's important to know that this data is stored in 2 locations. Over here on the right, we get the Pivot Table Fields task pane. The top part lists all of the fields. We only have 1 field, so there's only 1 field. And the bottom part is where we create our unique lists, and the values area is where we make our calculation. Now to create the unique list, I'm going to hover over the field, and I can create a unique list by clicking and dragging to the columns. Notice the blue at the top. That means the column area. The filter, but the one we want is the rows area. And notice that blue, that means when I drop it, instantly I get a unique list in the rows. To count the occurrence of each phone, we simply drag the same field, but now we drag it down to values. And because there's text data in this field, when I drop it, the aggregate calculation defaults to count. If this were a number field and we dragged it down to values, it would default to sum. Now those calculations are easy to change, and we'll see how to change it many times. Now I want to change the label at the top of this report, so I'm going to type phones. And when I hit Tab, it actually changes the name over here. I'll type frequency and enter. That's how fast and easy it is to create a basic frequency distribution, a unique list, a count of each, and a total at the bottom of the column that counts the total number of observations. Now our next task here is to calculate the percent of total. So I need to take 41 divided by 200, 36 divided by 200, and so on. Now last video we saw how to do this with formulas, but pivot tables are easy. Click and drag and drop it a second time. We get a duplicate count, but now we want to change the calculation. And in a pivot table, it's easy to do. Whatever field you dropped into the values area, you come into the pivot table and right-click. And there's two ways to change the calculation. Summarize values by. That allows you to change the aggregate calculation. Now we have count, which is what we want. Remember, our goal is to take each individual count and divide by the column total. So now we go to our second option for changing calculations, show values as. And there's all of these additional calculations that we can make on top of the aggregate calculation. And so the one we want is percent of column total. So when I click, it took each individual value divided by the column total and added percent number formatting. In the top cell, I'll type a new label and enter. Now I want to show you the keyboard shortcut to create a pivot table. I want to click in a single cell, and the keyboard I'm going to teach you is an Alt keyboard. This is like the coolest efficiency trick in Excel. Now we have a single cell selected, and I want you to just tap the Alt key. So here I go. I'm going to tap the Alt key. What? A bunch of screen tips pop up. And notice the screen tip by insert is N. So now I'm not holding Alt. I'm going to, in succession, hit the N key. And now what happens? The screen tips open up on the Insert tab. I can see a V next to Pivot Table, so I select V. And then we have 4 locations that we can get data from. From Table Range, which is what we want, and then 3 other locations. But that T, when I hit T, bam, there's our Insert Pivot Table dialog box. Now I want to click the Escape key. And the reason that Alt keyboards exist is so that when you're in your job and you do something all the time, you can teach yourself the keyboard. Just to emphasize that these keyboards are for your own personal use, I'm going to highlight this range right here. And imagine I wanted to clear the formatting. Well, I don't know the keyboard, but I know that on the Home Ribbon tab, from the Editing Group Clear dropdown, there's Clear Formats. So if this is something I do all the time, I would teach myself the keyboard. Now, the first couple times you do it, you have to go slow because you don't know what the keyboard shortcut is. Alt, I see an H, so I tap H. I see an E, so I tap E. And an F, so I type F. Now, the first couple times that you do it, you have to look at the Alt keyboard screen tips. And that's why Microsoft programmed it that way. But after a while, since this is something you do all the time, you'll memorize it, and it will be lightning fast. Now I'm going to Control Z on this, Control Z. I'm going to click in a single cell, Alt NVT. And I want to put this pivot table on a new worksheet. That is the default. Not only that, but when you have a button in a dialog box that's highlighted, that means the Enter key will invoke that. So I'm going to click Escape and watch how fast it is to create a pivot table on a new sheet. Alt NVT, Enter. Bam! Just like that. I come down, I double click and rename it. Enter. I come over to the pivot table field list, drag down to rows, drag down to values, drag it a second time, right click, show values as, percent of column total. Phones tab, frequency tab, percent frequency, enter, and I'm done. Now, I might want to change the column widths. Here's a great trick. I'm going to select the A column header, click, drag to C, and then double click between any one of the columns, and it best fits each one of those columns. I'm going to click in the top cell and control and roll my wheel. All right, let's go back over to pivot tables. All right, so that's our first tabular pivot table report based on some data in the Excel worksheet. Now I want to jump to the next sheet, so I'm going to dot, dot, dot. And for this Power Query pivot table example, we don't have the data in the worksheet. We need to import the CSV file before we can make our pivot table report. Now at our People website or in the link below the video, I'm going to right-click, Save Link As. Now in File Explorer, I have my folder selected, and I want you to notice that the extension is .csv, and it has an Excel icon, but it's not an Excel file. If you double-click and open this, now in this CSV file, we get a preview of this table. But guess what? This is not an Excel file. .csv. That means if you try to make a pivot table in this CSV file and save it, you will lose all your work. Now, there's three different options you have. You can copy the data from the CSV file and then go paste it in the Excel file. You can use the Save As feature. F12 is the Save As feature, and change the extension to .xlsx or .xlsm. Or in our case, because this 7-column table is not in the proper form for the proper data set that we need, we're going to go over to the Excel file and use Power Query to import the CSV. And during the import process, we'll fix the data and then load it to the Excel worksheet. Now make sure that inside your folder you have the Excel file. That's where we're going to initiate the import process. And you have the CSV file. Now, this CSV file stands for comma separated value. And I want to open it and show you what these values look like. Let's right-click and point to Open With. You can open it with Notepad, WordPad, or Word. But if you open it with Excel, then you see it as an Excel file. But by opening it with one of these, when we click, we can see, in fact, that each bit of data is separated by a comma. Now, there's a special name for that comma. It's called a delimiter. When you're dealing with data, a delimiter means what character separates the bits of data. Now, what's so important about this is that systems communicate with each other by sending data in a comma-separated value, or you can see text files, and instead of the delimiter being a comma, it's a tab. And knowing what a delimiter is important because during the import process, it'll ask you, what is the delimiter? We're going to close this. In our Excel file on the sheet Power Query and Pivot Table, I want to go up to the Data Ribbon tab. And Power Query is everything in the groups Get and Transform Data and Queries and Connections. Now in this class, we'll import data from the Get and Transform group. Get Data dropdown. I click, point to From File. And the two options we'll have for data sources is we'll import data from a different workbook or from a text or CSV file. We're going to click this option. You navigate to the location, select the file, click Import, or you can simply double-click. In the next dialog box, the file name is at the top. Make sure that the delimiter is a comma, and you want to click Transform Data. Do not click Load. Do not click Cancel. Click Transform Data. When we click this, it opens the Power Query Editor. And it is a separate window sitting on top of the Excel window. Over on the right, we have the Query Setting pane. There's the name of the query and the automatic steps that have been created. Now, before we look at those steps, let's highlight the name, and I want to rename this query. Now, I'm going to name it something that indicates what type of data this is. Pickup truck table, and enter. Now, applied steps, there's 3 steps. These are the automatic steps that Power Query is taking to import and transform the data. The first step, source, that's just connecting to that CSV file. And I want you to notice the first row contains the field names. Those really need to be up at the top as proper field names. Well, the second automatic step when we import a CSV file is promote headers. And sure enough, it promoted the headers. Now we have proper field names. Now for each field name, to the left of the field name is something called a data type. And I want you to click the ABC. These are all the data types that are available in Power Query. And I want you to notice the left alignment. If we imported this data with numbers as text, we already saw from an earlier video that that causes big trouble. But the third automatic step, bam, it changed the data type. So for acceleration for these pickup trucks, if I click the data type icon, that 1.2 is the icon to represent decimal number data type. That 1, 2, 3, that's the icon that represents the whole number data type. And then the remaining ones are ABC. That indicates text. So setting data types as part of the import process is an advantage to using Power Query, because with data types, it can assure that our calculations in the worksheet will work correctly. All right, so these are the 3 automatic steps. But we have one task here. Now, homework problem number 25 in the textbook, they give you a data set similar to this. And there's an element field, but they give the element field as 2 separate fields. And we want it as one field. So we need to merge these 2 fields. Luckily, Power Query makes this easy. I'll select the first field, hold Shift, click the second field. And I want to transform these 2 fields into a single field. So in the Power Query ribbon tabs, we want to select the Transform tab, go over to Text Column, and there it is, the Merge Columns button. When I click, it wants to know if we want a separator. I do want a separator, so I'm going to click the drop-down, go down to Custom, and type a dash. Now we need a new column name, so I'll highlight, and I'll call it something like Truck Element. And now when I click OK, I get a 4th step that we created, and bam, there's our one single element field. Now we're ready to load this to the Excel worksheet. So we go over to the Home ribbon tab, Close Group. If you click the Close and Load button, it loads it to a new sheet and names the sheet whatever the query name is. But that's not what we want. We want to click the drop down and Close and Load to. This gives you the full power to load it exactly where you want. So I'm going to click in the Import Data dialog box. The default is loaded as an Excel table on a new worksheet. I don't want a new worksheet. I'm going to click Existing. And I happen to be in B2, and that's where I want it. Now for us, we want to load it as an Excel table because then it's in the worksheet. And from that table, we can create pivot tables and formula solutions. If you're just doing a pivot table, you can load it directly to the PivotTable Cache and either build a report or a chart. And if you ever get more than 1 million rows of data, you can use only create a connection and then check add to the data model. That's a behind-the-scenes columnar database where you hold big data. All right, existing table. I'm going to click OK. And there's our imported and transformed table of data. Over here on the right, the Queries and Connections pane opens up, and that's our query. If this pane is not open, or you want to open it later, you come over to Data, Queries and Connections, and click Queries and Connections. Now, the reason this is important is because you're allowed to go back and edit the import and transformation steps. So for example, I actually made a mistake here. I did not want a dash. I wanted a space, a dash, and a space. Even though this is already loaded, I can go back and edit. We can double-click the query to open the query in the Power Query window. Here's our applied steps. And for the gear icons, if you click, it allows you to edit. So now instead of just a dash, I'm going to put space, dash, space. Click OK. And now we change the separator, and now there's a space, a dash, and a space. Now, there's lots of great uses for editing a query. One that I often do is I'll forget to add the right data type. So I'm building a pivot table, and my numbers are text. No problem. I open up the query, change the data type, and when I load it, everything's working. Now, we've already loaded this one time, so all we have to do is click the Close and Load. And just like that, we have a different separator in the first column. Now in this pickup truck table of data, we have one element field and 5 variable fields. In the recommended column, we have categorical data at the nominal level. In the owner satisfaction column, we have ordinal data. And then in the overall score, overall miles per gallon and acceleration, those are quantitative variables, all ratio level. Now, overall score is a discrete variable. We can only get a whole number value. But overall miles per gallon and acceleration are continuous variables that depend on how they're being measured. Using the pivot table tool, our goal from the recommended column, we simply want to create this tabular report that counts yeses and nos. From the overall score, we want to count how many trucks fit into categories such as 64 to 67, 68 to 71. And then from the acceleration, we want to count with the categories 7 to 8 seconds, 8 to 9 seconds, and so on. These 3 reports are called frequency distributions. That's a tabular summary that shows a unique list of non-overlapping categories with the counts, the frequency, for each category. All right, to create our first tabular report, you click in any one single cell, and we're going to use our keyboard, Alt-NVT, clicking existing, the location. I'm going to put it in I2, click OK. And this is the power and ease of pivot tables. Recommended, we drag it down to rows. And instantly, we get a unique list. This is a text field, so we drag it to values. We get our count. And now we can rename our column header. And we're done. It looks like 12 of the vehicles are recommended and 9 are not recommended. Now let's create our next tabular report from overall score. Click in any one cell and then use the keyboard, Alt-NVT. Now we're going to put this pivot table, let's say in I8. And this is dangerous in the sense of that's a live pivot table up there. If I drag some fields into the row area, and this report needed to extend down below where I'm putting this second pivot table, I would get a warning. But in this case, we're going to keep that pivot table exactly as it is. So I'm going to click OK. Now we want to drag the overall score down to the rows area. And when I drag it down and drop it, instantly I get a unique list. Now my goal is to count. And sometimes you want the unique list and then you count. Other times we'll see how to create those grouping categories with a lower and upper limit. But let's see what happens if we drag overall score, which is a number field, down to values. The default calculation is sum. But as we know, it's easy to change our calculations. Right-click in the values area, summarize values by, and we're going to change it to count. Now, this pivot table is fine. It tells us, looks like 83 and 84 and 76 as overall scores. Each had 3 occurrences. But we want to group. To group numbers or dates or times in the row area of a pivot table, you click in a cell and right-click Group. And this is a pretty amazing dialog box. It shows the min, the max, and the by is the increment or the step or the size of the category. It's the distance between the upper and lower limit. Now, the difference between 64 and 87, including both the 64 and 87, is 24. So I'm going to take that total range and make sure I give it an increment or a by that is evenly divisible into 24. So I'm going to try 4 to start this off. And this is really the art side of statistics. So when I click OK, that is pretty amazing. It totally grouped and gave us the labels, 64-67, 68 to 71. Now, what happened to 72 to 75? Well, there are no scores that fit into that category. So then the next displayed category is 76 to 79. Now, if you want to show that category, right-click, go down to Field Settings. In the Field Settings dialog box, go to Layout and Print, and then check Show Items with No Data. Now, when you do this, it shows the other 2 categories that are hidden. And the pivot table is really polite in this regard. We typed in 64 and 87, but it knows that we humans make mistakes. And just in case there's some data less than the lower limit we give it or greater than the upper limit we give it, it includes these two extra categories. Now I'm going to right-click, Field Settings, Layout and Print, and uncheck, click OK. Now I do want to change the label. And it's easy to change this. If you look at this, we can clearly see 5 fell between 76 and 79, 7 between 80 and 83, and 5 between 84 and 87. So most of them are in the upper range. But if you want to see a slightly different shape to the count of the data, right-click, Group, and we can change it. 6 is also evenly divisible by 24, so let's try 6. And it looks like we get the same pattern, right? Most of the counts are in the upper scores, 76 and above. Now I'm going to Control-Z and leave it at by 4. That means there's 4 possible scores in this category, 4 in this category, and so on. Now the important thing to learn about the Excel grouping feature from this example is that when you have a column of integer or whole numbers, the categories created will always have a lower limit that is exactly 1 more than the upper limit from the previous category. So 64 to 67, that means the next category has to start at 68. Here, upper limit is 83, so the next category lower limit starts at 84. Now the grouping feature will create different categories when the numbers have decimals. So let's see what those categories are. Let's click in a single cell, and we're going to use our keyboard, Alt-NVT. Click Existing, and we'll be dangerous and put this in cell I-17. Click OK. Now watch what happens when I drag the acceleration column down to rows. Well, of course, I get a unique list. But when we group, right-click, Group, and in this case, these are seconds. And it looks like the range is from 7 to 11. So I'm going to create a starting point of 7 and an upper limit of the last category of 11. We pushed the lower limit of the first category lower than any value in our data set. And the upper limit of the last category is larger than any data points in the column. Now we'll use by or step or increment of 1 second. Now watch what happens when I click OK. We get 7 to 8 seconds, and then 8 seconds to 9 seconds. From the display of these categories, it looks like we're going to double count the number 8, the number 9, and the number 10. Well, the good news is internally inside the pivot table, when you use decimal data like this, the upper limit is never included. So if there's a number 8 in this data set, it gets counted here. For example, this 10, it is not counted in this category. It'll be counted in this category. The lower limit is included. The upper limit is not. Now let's test this out. Let's drag acceleration down to values. And when we drag it down here, remember, this is a number field. But because we have already grouped these to create categories, the aggregate calculation defaults to count. We have a count of 8 in the category 10 all the way up to, but not including 11. If I change this to a number in the 9 to 10 category, let's change it to 9.9. Now, when I hit Enter, the pivot table will not update. Only worksheet formulas update instantly when source data changes. When I hit Enter, we have to come over to the pivot table and refresh the PivotTable Cache. And the way we do that is right-click, Refresh. And just like that, the 10 to 11 count has changed from 8 to 7. And the 9 to 10 category has changed from 6 to 7. Now I'm going to come up and change this back. Now it's a 10, so that 7 better increase to 8 when I right-click Refresh. And now the 10 is being counted in the last category. Now we do not want to leave these ambiguous categories. When someone's looking at this, they don't know the internal workings of the pivot table and that the 8 is not included here, but it's included here. So when we group with decimal numbers, we want to change the report so that it is not ambiguous. Now there's 3 ways we can do this. One way to do this is to change the label at the top. I'm going to hit the F2 key, and in parentheses, I'll type upper limit not included. Control Enter, and then add some wrap text. Change the column width. Now I'm going to leave that there and show you the other two methods, which if I use the other two methods, I probably wouldn't use that method there. The other method is to change the dash to something like up to, or to use math comparative operators to be 100% not ambiguous. Now the label we could use, and this is acceptable, you could say the lower limit up to the upper limit. And that indicates that the upper limit is not included. If you use comparative operators, since 7 is the lower limit, the seconds to be counted in this category have to be greater than or equal to, and I'll type out seconds, and it has to be simultaneously less than the upper limit, which in this case is 8. Now I definitely don't want to type this, so the fast and easy way to do this is to highlight the labels, go up to the Home ribbon tab, Editing Group, find and select dropdown, and the Replace feature. Now I do this all the time, and you can see the keyboard there. It's Control H. So let's Control H. And in Find What, I'm looking for that dash. And then Replace, by all means, use up to. That's the shortest and easiest one. And this math label that I'm going to create, a space, less than or equal to, and then type seconds, and then less than space. This sort of is cumbersome if you have a report that you're going to give to someone, but it is the most exact. I'm going to click Replace All. Click OK, click Close. And let's change this to frequency. However you do it, don't leave those labels ambiguous. Now, the last important topic about grouping numbers in a pivot table is if you create a new report, Alt-NVT, we'll put it down here, click OK. And I've already grouped overall score. So if I drag it down to the rows area, the PivotTable Cache remembers that grouping. Now, sometimes that's not what you want. Maybe you want a unique list of values here, or you want to group it in a different way. Now, the reason that this happens is because when you create a pivot table from a data source, it stores the data in a behind-the-scenes pivot table cache only one time. And then every time you make a new pivot table, it uses that same cache of data. Now, it does that for a good reason, because if it created a new cache of data every time you made a pivot table report, in a file with 30 reports, you would repeat that data set 30 times. And that would blow up your file size and slow things down. But luckily, if you do want to create a new pivot table with a different type of grouping, you can do it if you add the PivotTable Wizard button to your QAT. Now, in an earlier video, we learned how to modify this, and it's easy. Right-click, Customize Quick Access Toolbar, choose All Commands. In the list, click, type the letter P. That jumps to the P's, and then scroll down. And you have to hunt for Pivot Table and Pivot Chart Wizard. And then you add it to your Quick Access Toolbar. Then you click in a single cell, use that button, or you can use the old keyboard from Excel 2003 and before. That's like a 20-year-old keyboard, Alt-DP. Either the keyboard or that button will open up the wizard. You select List or Database, Pivot Table, Next. It got the data set, Next. I'm going to put it on the existing right next to this. And when we click Finish, now we get a new cache of data, and we can drag overall score or acceleration. And in each case, we get a unique list. And now we can group it however we would like. All right, in this video, we learned how to use the Pivot Table tool to create these frequency distributions based on categorical or quantitative data. And we learned how to use Power Query, these two groups in the Data Ribbon tab, to import and transform our CSV data. Now, next chapter, chapter 2, we'll do descriptive statistics, and we'll study tabular and graphical methods of summarizing data. And these frequency distributions will be a large part of what we do next chapter and throughout the rest of the textbook, because much of probability is based on counting occurrences of items across a unique list of categories. Now, here's another hot tip. For all the Excel files that we use with the videos, the yellow sheets and the red sheets, if you highlight them, you can print these notes out. Control P, and I did page setup so they print out nicely. So if you want your notes about frequency distributions, pivot tables, and Power Query, or in earlier videos for chapter number 1, the list of formula elements or cursors or keyboards, you can just print those out and have them to read. All right, that's the end of chapter 1. Inside the folder that you built watching video number 1, you should have these 4 files. This file you have to download from within Canvas. This has the homework templates, the sheets that you use to complete the problems, and it has the solutions for you to check your answer. This file right here is the file that you'll use to import for homework problem number 25. Now, I want to double click and open this and look at the homework file. When you get this yellow security warning at the top, click Enable. And then just as with the video Excel files, the blue sheet is where you do your homework. So this is the data set for homework problem number 2. And after you're done completing the homework problem from the textbook, then you can go look at the answers. So for each homework problem, the blue sheet is the one you work on. The red sheet is for you to check your work after you complete the homework problem. All right, we'll see you next video.